Cowboy brought her bread and milk for a week. Then sighed, I brought my heart too. If you'll take it, before we begin, take a moment to comment. Your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now, lean back and enjoy the story. The wind howled along the ridges of Wyoming, sharp and merciless, slicing at the skin like a hunter's blade. Snow lashed sideways, swallowing up every trace of a trail within seconds. And there, clinging to the slope of Widow's Ridge, stood a crooked wooden cabin, its chimney breathing out the thinnest wisp of smoke, trembling like the last breath of a weary soul. Inside, Lorian knelt by a struggling fire, her hands trembling as she pressed small scraps of kindling together. Behind her, 2 children, curled beneath a patchwork quilt, their tiny bodies shivering against both the cold and the heavy weight of loneliness. The flames danced weakly, too feeble to chase away the frost or the despair pressing down on that house. Then came a sound, a knock, slow, steady. Out here, in the teeth of such a storm, no sane man would come calling, unless fate itself had led him there. The door swung open, and the wind rushed in like a thief. A lone cowboy filled the doorway. Snow plastered across his hat, his coat soaked through with ice. But in his hands, he carried no rifle, no coins to bargain with. Instead, he held out a rough-wrapped loaf of bread and a bottle of milk still warm to the touch. He offered them without flourish, without words, just the silence of a man carrying what little he had in surplus to the place where it was needed most. It was a small act, simple enough, but it lit that cabin brighter than any fire could. And from the moment he knocked upon her door, life inside that house would never again be the same. The western wind swept dust across the tracks of an abandoned railroad, whispering its mournful song between the rusted rails. The little town that once thrived at the base of Widow's Ridge now stood hollowed out. Swinging signs creaked on empty porches. The saloon windows were dark, and only echoes lingered where travelers once came and went. Down the scarlet dirt road rode a man, Rowan McAllister, 36 years old, a cowboy who made his living trailing cattle, sometimes hiring out his gun to guard wagon trains. His long coat carried the dust of too many miles. His worn boots struck the wooden boards of the saloon porch with the lonely ring of spurs. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed half his sunburned face, leaving only his eyes, uncovered eyes that had seen too much loss, too much cruelty on this wild land. And yet, in those eyes, there still flowed something gentle, a hidden spring in the desert. Rowan was not a man of loud words or empty promises. He wasn't one for speeches or boasts. Instead, He gave what he had, in quiet measure, to those who had nothing left. On the rickety porch of Lorien Odell, a woman abandoned, left to raise her children alone. Rowan placed the loaf and the milk into her hands. When her wary eyes searched his face, unsure of his intent, he spoke just one simple truth. I got more than I need. Not pity, not charity, just the fairness of one soul who could spare something and another who sorely needed it. And in that instant, the wind outside seemed to soften. The flames in the hearth leapt brighter. A short sentence, yet strong enough to erase the gulf between the giver and the one receiving. Part 1. The stranger on the ridge. The blizzard swept white across the Wyoming sky, the wind screaming through bare pines, hurling shards of ice into the void. On the trail climbing Widow's Ridge, no one in their right mind would ride this time of year. No one but a lone rider on a weary horse. Rowan McAllister hunched low in the saddle, snow crusting across his coat, the brim of his hat pulled down to guard eyes that still burned steady in the storm. His horse snorted smoke into the frozen air, hooves crunching heavy on the hard-packed snow. In the distance, a frail ribbon of smoke lifted from the chimney of a sagging cabin. The chimney shook, as though even the warmth inside was flickering toward its end. Rowan tightened the reins, familiar with the endless trails of the frontier. He'd ridden hundreds of miles through storms like this, but tonight wasn't just about surviving the blizzard. Tonight, his horse was carrying him to a place where a heart was waiting for a hand. He had no speeches ready, no promises, no pity, only a rough-wrapped loaf of bread in his satchel and a bottle of milk, still warm from a neighbor's cow. In a cowboy's hands, such small things could mean the difference between fading away and holding on. His knuckles tapped against the weathered wood of the cabin door. The sound was thin, nearly swallowed by the wind, yet it would become a memory that no storm could erase. The door cracked open. A gust rushed in, carrying Rowan's tall, lean frame with it. Lorien Odell knelt by a weak fire, hands trembling as she fed in sticks of kindling. The flickering light revealed her hollow cheeks, her eyes ring-dark from sleepless nights. Behind her, 2 children huddled beneath a patchwork quilt, wide eyes fixed on the stranger in the doorway. Rowan stopped on the threshold. He didn't enter. Instead, he pulled off his gloves, extending the bread and the milk wrapped in cloth. I got more than I need, he said softly, no flourish, no mercy in his voice. Just plain truth. Lorien lifted her head. There was steel in her eyes, the weary caution of a woman forced to defend what little she had left. But her hand still reached, trembling, to take what he offered in her arms. That bread became treasure. The younger child stirred, her gaze sparking with the innocent hunger of hope. Rowan caught that look, and in that fleeting moment, the hardened quiet of his cowboy heart began to ease. Silence pressed around them. Only the wind shrieked outside. Only the fire crackled inside. Yet the silence wasn't empty anymore. It carried the breath of something changed. Lorian set the milk near the hearth, her cracked hand pressing against the warm glass, as if to let the heat soak into her skin. Her eyes lingered on Rowan, still shadowed with doubt. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Rowan only shrugged, his eyes deep, steady. "I got plenty, that's all." In that cramped room, his words didn't fall like charity, but as a simple law of the West out here. The living shared what they could, or no one lasted long. Lorian's lips pressed tight. Perhaps she wanted to say, "Thank you," but the pride of an abandoned woman held the words back. Only her eyes betrayed her, glimmering with a gratitude too stubborn to speak. The children clutched the bread in silence. One gripped it as though afraid it might vanish. The other just watched Rowan with clear, unblinking eyes. Rowan nodded gently to them, then turned to leave. He hadn't come to linger, only to remind them that somewhere, someone still remembered their firelight. Outside, the storm raged on, but for the first time in months, the flames in Lorian's hearth weren't the only warmth in her home. Rowan pulled his coat tight as he mounted again, the horse stamping sparks from frozen stone. He didn't look back, yet in his mind, he carried Lorian's face, exhausted, cautious, but with a light still refusing to die. The wind blurred his eyes, but it couldn't wash away the image of those two children beneath their quilt. He had seen too many broken homes, too many women left behind on this merciless land. Rarely had one shaken him so deeply. He asked himself if he'd return tomorrow. The answer came as sure as the beat of hooves under him. Yes, not from duty, not from pity, but because once a man sees something, he can't pretend he hasn't. The road stretched white and endless. Yet within Rowan, something had begun, like a hidden spring, stirring beneath frozen ground. At dawn, with the sky still pale behind the mountains, smoke rose once more from that small cabin. Rowan appeared again, this time with a sack holding a few eggs and a strip of salted meat. He knocked, his weathered hand more used to guns and reins, finding purpose in this simple act. Placing food in a mother's hands, little Vera, the youngest, ran to the door, her gap-toothed grin bright as morning. Her laughter cracked open the silence like a bell, the purest sound Rowan had heard all winter. Lorian stepped out onto the porch, clutching a frayed shawl. She still didn't speak thanks, but her eyes had softened, less guarded, less cold. Rowan set the food in her hands, dipped his head once, and said only, "See you tomorrow." The cowboy's figure vanished once more into the snow, but this time the cabin on Widow's Ridge no longer trembled with silence. Inside Lorian's heart, a strange new question rose. Would he truly come back again? A loaf of bread, a bottle of milk, a small act of kindness. Yet in the West, such things could stitch together two lonely hearts. And out there in the storm, listeners cannot help but feel there are still men who choose to stay, who choose to knock upon a door with nothing but quiet decency. Part 2. The First Crack. The storm lingered for days. Wind shrieked through broken shingles, rattling the warped wooden walls. Yet each morning, steady hoofbeats tapped across the snow-packed trail. Rowan appeared like clockwork, without warning, without promise. Vera, the younger child, cheeks raw from the cold, was the first to break the silence. She ran barefoot across the boards, leaving tiny prints in the snow. When Rowan knocked, she flung the door wide and leapt out, her toothless grin splitting against the bitter wind. "Rowan," she cried, her voice cutting bright against the storm. He knelt, pressing a warm loaf into her arms. She hugged it to her chest as though it were treasure, eyes glowing with a light that seemed to summon spring itself. Never had Rowan thought a simple loaf could make a child's gaze shine so fiercely. From the shadows of the porch, Lorian watched, her hand clutching the edge of her shawl, lips pressed tight. She wanted to call her daughter back, to guard the line she had drawn against the world. But the sound of Vera's giggles, the sight of her clutching that bread, something in her chest softened. A child's laughter had managed to carve the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. That afternoon, Rowan lingered. He sat on the porch steps, back resting against a post, watching the snow-thick pines. His hat brim shaded his face, breath steaming into the frozen air. Lorian stepped out, shawl wrapped tight, her eyes still guarded, but she did not drive him away. "You don't have to keep coming," she said, her voice low as the wind. Rowan tilted his head, gaze fixed on the ridge. "I've got more than I need," he answered. "This house doesn't." A silence stretched between them, not a wall this time, but a bridge. Lorian smoothed Vera's hair as the child clung to her skirt. Bread pressed tight to her chest, and for the first time, Lorian did not feel shame in receiving. Instead, she felt the weight on her shoulders ease just a little. That night, the cabin was no longer hollow. The soup pot, thin as it was, held a few potatoes Rowan had brought. Clara, the elder daughter, ladled an extra spoonful for her sister, stifling a giggle. Vera clutched the crust she refused to finish, as though it were a charm against despair. By the firelight, Lorian's weary face softened. It had been months since children's laughter had lifted these rafters. Small though it was, that laughter held the house upright for one more night. She looked to the empty chair beside the hearth, and Rowan's image flickered in her mind. Snow-dusted coat, steady eyes, bread in hand, a stranger who asked nothing, only gave. And in that quiet moment, Lorian realized a crack had opened in her defenses, and through it, light had begun to seep in. At dawn, when Rowan knocked again, Vera darted so fast she nearly slipped on the ice. She wrapped her arms around his leg, laughing. Rowan froze, then chuckled softly, brushing the child's hair aside. His eyes lifted and met Lorian's. This time, she did not look away. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked, her voice softer than before. Rowan waited, then answered, slow and plain. "Sometimes a person just needs to know. Someone will knock." The words caught in her throat. For months she had listened for hoofbeats that never came, the sound of a man who had left and would not return. But the knock at her door came instead from someone else. No tears, no debts, no promises, only presence. Lorian looked down at Vera, saw the trust burning in her child's eyes. That trust did what no words could. It broke her guard. A sharp question rose in her chest. Could I believe again? That evening, Rowan left later than usual. The moon cast his shadow long across the snow as he rode away. Lorian stood in the doorway, clutching her children close, watching him vanish into the pale night. Doubt still clung, fear still lingered, but something undeniable had shifted. The wall she had built had cracked, and through that crack, children's laughter, hope's glimmer, and the quiet presence of a cowboy had entered for the first time in many months. Lorian whispered into the night words, meant only for herself. "Thank you." No one heard but her, yet for a woman who had once sworn she'd never thank anyone again, it was the first step. A child's laughter, an innocent hug, a loaf clutched like a talisman. These had become the keys to unlock a mother's heart. And for those who listen, the truth is clear. Trust is not rebuilt by grand promises, but by the unguarded eyes of a child. Part 3. The Frozen Porch. The morning wind slipped through the cracks of the boards, carrying the bite of fresh snow, and the resin scent of pine split open overnight. On the porch, a thin layer of ice jeweled the railing, glittering like spilled glass. Lorian opened the door, clutching a worn shawl, its fringe unraveling like dry grass at season's end. She had grown used to standing in shadow, waiting for the knock, but today, without knowing why, her feet carried her out. Before it came, Rowan was already there. His horse lingered at the edge of the porch, its breath puffing into clouds. The faint scrape of a spur on wood stilled, giving way to the creak of saddle leather. Snow clung to the brim of his hat. His long coat, darkened by the wind's lash, dust-stained boots now carried streaks of ice and mud. He set down a cloth bag on the step. A loaf, wrapped in brown linen, a bottle of milk, cushioned in a clean scrap of cloth. "Morning," he said, voice gentle against the cold. Lorien pulled the shawl tighter, standing straighter to hide the tremor in her hand. "Wind strong today." Rowan nodded, strong enough to remind a man not to wander too far. Silence stretched. Once, silence had been a wall between them. Today, it felt like a bridge. Lorien reached for the bag. Warmth bled through the rough fabric, into her fingertips, then deeper to the chest she had kept locked. For the first time, she said what she truly thought. "You don't have to come every day." Rowan met her gaze. His eyes were steady, weathered as old timber, yet carrying a current of kindness beneath. "I've got more than I need," he said again, calm as stone. "And this house doesn't." The words of gratitude caught in Lorien's throat, too heavy to speak after so long unsaid. Instead, she tilted her head, letting her hair slip loose across her brow. A small gesture, her quiet permission for him to stay. Inside, Vera stirred, catching the scent of bread from the loft. Clara peered down, her wary eyes softer now, though still sharp with caution. "Our water bucket froze solid last night," Lorien murmured. "I've been melting snow, slow going." Rowan's eyes shifted to the porch, where a cracked barrel leaned. Its side split like lightning across a dry sky. "I can fit a new iron band. A few nails. Won't take much." A gust tugged at her shawl, brushing its fringe against his collar. He didn't flinch. Out here, men kept their hands close to a gun when facing strangers. But on that frozen porch, she saw only a pair of work-worn hands, searching for something to mend a quiet language of care, steady and wordless. From the kitchen, smoke rose with the sharp, sweet tang of pine resin. Lorien poured the steeped pine buds she kept for sore throats, thinned with the last of her honey. Carrying 2 tin cups to the porch, she caught Rowan off guard. He wasn't expecting it. The surprise softened his face. A man too long accustomed to living without such gestures. "It won't taste good," she said quickly, "but it's warm." He wrapped his hands around the cup, letting his breath cool it. "Warm's enough," he replied. They leaned against opposite posts, staring out through the snow-laden trees. Far below, the old railroad lay frozen, a steel snake asleep under ice. The unfinished tale of a town long gone, back when the whistle still blew. Lorien said, her voice like a memory stirring. I used to take the girls up that hill. They'd count the cars rolling past. Believed. The more cars they counted, the shorter the winter. She gave a thin laugh, brittle as ice. Since he left, the whistle's been gone too. Rowan's eyes lowered to the step where melting snow streaked dark across the grain. Sometimes what's gone teaches us to hear what remains, he said, like a horse breathing in the fog, or a fire whispering it still has flame. Lorien set her cup on the rail. And where'd you learn to hear things like that? In the saddle, he said, and on porches where the doors weren't shut to me. A sparrow struck the roof, snow scattering onto their shoulders. Lorien brushed her shawl lightly, and when they were shut, they were, he admitted, a short, humble smile, but not all. A few stayed open. That was enough. Her eyes lingered longer than politeness allowed. I always thought taking anything meant owing something back. Rowan rolled the cup in his hands, the heat moving through his calloused fingers. Out here, he said slowly, a good debt's a reminder that someone can still be trusted. Call it owing if you want. I call it the rope that ties a porch to the season. She whispered the words. Back the rope that ties a porch, testing how they felt on her tongue, unfamiliar. After years of silence, from inside came Vera's bright call, Mama! Lorien turned, but before stepping in, she paused, breath-catching. Stay, she said simply. The wind's against your face. It was the first time she had asked a man to remain. Rowan drew a short-bladed knife from his belt. Not a weapon, but a tool. He pried the iron band from the barrel, knocking gently until the wood's hollow voice told him where it leaked. Each nail he drove in stitched not only the barrel's seam, but the fragile fabric of that morning. Clara hovered at the doorway, arms wrapped around a quilt, her eyes sharp, yet curious. You know how to fix a barrel. Rowan didn't glance up. I know how to find where it leaks. And where's that? Where the wood breathes different. Clara tilted her head as if she'd just learned something worth keeping. Vera peeked out from behind her, nose red, clutching yesterday's bread. As though it were a charm. Hit it harder, she asked. No. Rowan smiled faintly. Too hard. It'll break. Just enough. Lorien watched, shawl tight around her, as her daughters learned lessons no school could give. That strength meant knowing how much to give and when to stop. She lifted her cup again, found it cold. Yet something inside her remained warm. Done, Rowan said at last, pouring a ladle of water. No leak. He tapped the iron band like an old friend. How much? Lorien asked. The reflex of one long used to bargaining with life. Rowan brushed his hands clean. One quick meal. And what's a quick meal? Standing on this porch with a warm cup, no talking required. She blinked, surprised. In the West, a man's work wasn't always paid in coin, but in presents. All right, she said softly. I'll steep more pine buds. They stood together, listening to the forest's hush. The railroad lay quiet, but not forgotten. Lorian didn't know if the future would come soft or hard, but she knew this. A barrel held water, a nail had found its mark, and a man had listened to the breath of wood. And maybe, just maybe, love in the Wild West wasn't always born in firestorms, but in the careful setting of one nail to keep what mattered from leaking away. Part 4. The Heart Hidden in the Bread. The sun slid down the mountainside, spilling gold across the frozen fields, staining the snow in patches of light. The wind no longer howled as it had in days past. It only sighed now through the pines, carrying with it the sharp sweetness of resin. At the end of the trail, Rowan's figure appeared slower than usual. His horse labored, breath steaming in the cold, hooves careful against brittle ice. Rowan's shoulders hunched low, his coat crusted with frost. He had spent the whole day hauling fence posts down in the valley, arms aching, hands raw, but still, in his satchel, rode a fresh loaf of bread and a bottle of milk wrapped safe. No matter his weariness, he could not let that porch wait empty. Lorian was already outside. She said nothing as she watched him approach, but her eyes, in the amber dusk, had softened, no longer distant, no longer shut. In these past days, she had grown used to hearing hoofbeats climb the ridge, used to the sight of his shape through snow. But tonight, when he came late, something in her chest stirred, unsettled, almost fear that he might not come at all. Rowan dismounted, breath ragged. He placed the bag in her hands, bowing his head slightly. The bread still warm. I'm late. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, only for a moment. But enough for her to feel the weight of his labor, the ache in his body, and enough for her to know no man braves the storm, climbs the ridge, and brings bread like this, unless he has laid his heart inside it. Inside, the fire crackled higher than usual. Clara busied herself with bowls. Vera skipped around the table, clutching the bread like treasure. Lorian set the milk near the hearth, pouring a small cup for the girls, but her eyes drifted back toward the porch, where Rowan sat on the steps, gloves off, letting the cold bite into his skin. She carried out a steaming tin cup, set it before him. You need this, she said simply. Rowan looked up, surprised, then nodded. Thank you. He sipped, slow. When he set it down, his eyes found hers and held, no words between them. Yet the silence was thick, with something waiting to be spoken. From within came children's laughter, high and bright. But on the porch, time slowed. Rowan's shoulders sank, and he drew breath. His voice, when it came, was rough but steady. "Lorien," he said, "all this week I've brought bread, milk, salt meat, but there's something else I've carried with me." Her brow furrowed, half wary, half expectant. "What is it?" Rowan swallowed, his gaze never leaving her. "My heart. I brought it here. If you'll take it." The words fell into the fading light, plain and heavy, no flourish, no polished speech, only the truth of a man who had always spoken more in deeds than in promises. Lorien froze. Her heart, bound so long by pride and hurt, trembled like dry wood struck by flame. For years she had been abandoned, left to bear everything alone, convinced no one would stay. And now, here was this man, quiet, steadfast, bringing not only bread and milk, but also his heart. "Rowan," she whispered, her throat tight. "You don't understand. I've already lost too much." Rowan bowed his head, calloused hands knotting loosely together. "I understand enough," he said, "enough to know you fought alone. But I've seen you, the way you keep the fire for those girls, the way you won't let this house fall, and I'll walk through snow every day, if it means you don't have to carry it all alone anymore." Tears welled in Lorien's eyes. She turned aside, but too late to hide them. It had been so long since someone had truly seen her. Rowan lifted a hand, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was simple, almost awkward, like handling something fragile for the first time. Lorien closed her eyes, leaning gently into his palm, and for a moment the cold around the porch melted, leaving only the warmth of truth between them. The door creaked. Vera peeked out, eyes wide. "Mama," she asked, "is Mr. Rowan staying for supper?" Lorien laughed through her tears, a sound, both fragile and free. She turned to him, lips curving softly. "You'll stay, won't you?" Rowan did not answer with words. He only nodded, slow and sure, and in the glow of twilight, that nod carried the weight of a vow, carved into timber. That night, they shared a simple pot of potato stew. Vera's laughter rang bright. Clara watched closely, then sighed in quiet relief, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Rowan ate little, spoke less, yet in each gesture, the way he set a potato in Vera's bowl or nudged the bread toward Lorien, there was the steady presence of a man who meant to stay. Afterward, he helped pile more wood on the fire, tightened the hinge on the door. No one mentioned his confession, but all of them knew Rowan no longer brought only food. He had placed his heart within these walls. That night, the sky cleared, Stars spilled across the ridge like a river of silver. Rowan stepped onto the porch, face lifted to the heavens. Lorien joined him, shawl around her shoulders. They stood close, their breath mingling in the air. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Giving your heart to someone broken?" Rowan turned, voice quiet, resolute. "I'm not giving it to someone broken. I'm giving it to someone strong enough to rise from what's broken." Her body trembled, then released a long sigh. The weight of years slipping free, she reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, firm, interlaced, not promises, not pretty words, just presence. Above them, the stars were cold, but on that porch, two souls found warmth undeniable, and Rowan's voice carried into the night, steady as a brand, set deep. "I brought my heart here, and I'll stay if you'll let me." Lorien did not answer with words. She only laid her head on his shoulder, silent, and sometimes silence is the truest answer of all. Part 5. The Shared Fire. Night fell soft across the ridge. The storm had eased, leaving only a quiet wind threading through the cracks, humming like a sorrowful mountain song. In the small kitchen, firelight flickered against the walls, laying shadows over every crack, every battered pot with a broken handle, and yet the glow made it all feel warmer, more alive. Lorien bent to place a few pine logs on the fire. The smoke carried its sharp resin scent, blending with the faint sweetness of honey she had dripped into the kettle of steeped leaves. It was the only tea she could make bitter at first, but with a sweetness that lingered, enough to soften the long nights. At the table, Rowan pulled off his gloves. His hands, calloused from rope, blade, and rein, rested quietly now, as though afraid to disturb the fragile calm of the room. His eyes wandered the kitchen, the bare shelves, the crooked chair, the patched curtain. All of it spoke of hard years. Yet tonight, it no longer carried despair. Tonight, it looked like a place one might live, a place one might love. If two souls tended the fire together, Clara and Vera had already drifted to sleep in the corner, bundled deep in blankets. Only the two adults remained by the fire. Lorien poured the pine tea into a tin cup, its steam touched with honey. She set it gently before him. "It isn't good," she said softly, repeating words she'd spoken once before, "but it's warm." Rowan reached for it, and in that instant, his fingertip brushed hers, just a faint touch, like a string plucked on a lone fiddle in an empty room. Lorien startled, as if to draw back, but then her hand lingered one heartbeat longer in his. They looked at each other, no words, only the firelight catching in her eyes lined by weariness, yet reflecting a new brightness. and in Rowan's gaze there was a truth too plain to hide. A man of the West, worn and hardened, but still gentle enough to touch without breaking. He took a sip, bitter at first, then sweet. Rowan smiled faintly. It's warm. Lorien sat opposite, fingers laced in her lap, her heart drumming faster, like a hammer striking damp wood. The fire snapped softly, filling the silence. Rowan set the cup down, staring into the amber glow at its bottom. "Lorien," he said at last, careful, as if afraid the sound might scatter her. She lifted her head. "There's a lot I'm not good at," he said slowly. "I don't speak feelings easy. I don't make promises I can't see. But I know how to split wood, mend fences, ride through snow. And if you'll let me, I'd do those things for this house. Not just for one winter." Lorien clutched her shawl tighter. Her eyes brimmed, but she bit her lip to hold them back. "You don't understand," she whispered, voice trembling. "I've grown used to men leaving, used to standing in this house, hearing hooves fade away down the ridge." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Then, gently, he said, "Then get used to something different. Get used to hearing hooves coming closer." The words were plain, but they cut deeper than any vow. Lorien lowered her face, tears slipping into the fabric of her shawl. Rowan didn't move to her. He didn't try to fill the silence. He simply stayed. So she knew this quiet was no longer hers alone to carry. The wind sighed through the door frame. One girl turned in her sleep. The other mumbled a dream. The kitchen fire burned steady, warming the two figures at the table. Lorien lifted her head at last, eyes red but lit with something new. "Rowan," she said, his name spoken without hesitation for the first time. "If you truly stay, I can't promise the days will be easy. I have burdens, I have scars, and I am so tired." Rowan reached across the table, his hand finding hers. His grip was not tight, only steady, like the sure hold of Wyoming pine roots against stone. "I'm not here for the easy parts," he said. "I'm here for all of it. The burdens, the long days, the cold nights. I came because I see you, and I choose this place." Her hand trembled, but she did not pull away. In that quiet grip lay the first fragile trust, and for her it was as if she had stepped across a chasm. No further words were needed. The fire said enough when only coals glowed. Rowan rose, pulling on his coat. He stepped onto the porch to cinch his saddle. Dawn had not yet broken, but the eastern sky was thinning toward light. Lorien followed, shawl wrapped close. They stood side by side, looking at the horizon. Rowan tipped his head toward the shed. "I'll bring dry wood tomorrow. Looks like the stack's running low." Lorien studied him, her gaze steady now. Then she nodded once. "All right, I'll leave the door open. 2 simple words, but heavier than any vow. Leave the door open to let someone in, not just into a house, but into a heart. Rowan touched the brim of his hat, his eyes softening. He mounted, the iron shoes of his horse striking sure against the frozen ground. Lorien stood watching until his shape slipped into shadow. A faint smile curved her lips, fragile as the first crack in winter ice, yet beneath it, life stirred. Inside, the coals glowed red in the hearth. That fire no longer belonged to one person alone. It was a shared fire now. The warmth of a home being born. Part 6. If you stay outside. The wind howled long across the ridge. Pine shadows swayed, clawing the roof with a ghostly scrape. The small cabin clung to the mountainside like a boat adrift on a sea of snow. Inside, the fire had burned low, leaving only a bed of glowing coals. Clara and Vera slept soundly in the corner, their breathing soft, as 2 small birds tucked safe in a nest. Rowan sat at the table, working the worn leather strap that had followed him through many cattle seasons. Each time the wind shrieked, he lifted his eyes, scanning the room with the quiet watchfulness of a guard who would not sleep. Lorien stepped out from the children's room, shawl drawn around her shoulders. She paused in the doorway, watching him in the dim glow. His face caught the firelight in halves, one side shadowed, the other steady, lined with weariness, yet unshaken resolve. The sight tightened her chest. How long had it been since she had seen a man sit awake to guard the fire once the children were in bed? She crossed the room, settling into the chair across from him. The wind rattled the boards, but inside there was a new kind of stillness, the kind that comes when 2 people are no longer strangers. Her fingers tapped the tabletop, keeping rhythm with her heartbeat. Rowan, she whispered, voice rough and low. I don't know if I have anything left to give. I carry too many wounds and too much fear. He listened without interrupting, tilting his head so the unruly hair fell across one eye. His calloused hands stayed folded on the table, patient, unmoving. Men have promised before, she went on, voice shaking, and then they left. This house, this fire, they've all heard hooves riding away, never returning. I won't let my girls stand at the door again, staring down that ridge, waiting for someone who won't come back. Tears gathered. Lorien turned aside, clutching her shawl tight inside her. The wall she had built was splintering, yet fear clung stubbornly to the cracks. Rowan let out a slow breath. He nudged a cup toward her. I don't make pretty promises, he said. I can only tell you one thing for certain. I won't leave in the night. I'll be here in the wind, in the storm, and when it's quiet again, His words fell even, steady, like hoofbeats across the desert, and in Lorian's heart they stirred a long-buried hunger, the wish that, just once, someone would choose not to leave. The cabin held only the sound of the wind and their breath. Lorian lifted her gaze, her eyes wet but shining with something new. Her lips parted in a whisper she had not planned to speak. "If you mean to stay, stay for all of it." Rowan froze. The words were not a challenge nor a plea. They were an open door. A door straight into the heart of a woman, worn thin by waiting. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his, not tight, not hurried. His palm was rough, warm like pine wood weathered by both sun and storm. "I'm not here for the easy days," he said, his voice low, like timber groaning under a hammer. "I'm here for all of it. The dark nights, the long days, the cold winters. I came because I see you, and I choose this." Her tears spilled, falling onto his hand, and for the first time in years, she felt it. The weight of her loneliness lifted by another's choice to bear it too. Rowan rose, added wood to the stove. Flames leapt high, throwing light across Lorian's face. She did not look away, and in her eyes the doubt had begun to fade, replaced by a fragile trust. He came back, this time taking the seat beside her. No table between them. The wind still clawed at the cabin, but inside, the fire roared and drowned it out. Lorian tilted her head, resting it against his shoulder. Small as the gesture was, it spoke all she needed to say. Rowan said nothing. He simply wrapped an arm around her, holding firm. Out here, no long vows were needed. Staying through the storm was proof enough. Silence was no longer a void. It was a quilt drawn over them both. The night passed. When the first pale light touched the cracks of the shutters, the wind had stilled. The sky spread soft and blue. Rowan stepped outside, pulling the door open to the ridge below. Blanketed white, his horse shook its mane, breath curling into the cold air. Lorian stood behind him, her shawl loose around her shoulders. She saw his tall frame, his steady stance, and inside her, the old fear began to recede. This was the man who had sat by the fire all night, the man who had not left when the storm was at its worst. She stepped onto the porch, standing close. Her voice carried sure now, no tremor left. "Rowan, I believe." He turned, and his eyes softened. He spoke no words, only laid a hand on her shoulder, steady and certain. A gesture that was both promise and proof. Dawn spilled gold across the ridge. The porch, once a place of cold and emptiness, now held two figures standing side by side, and from that moment, everything had changed. Part 7. The Wood. the nail, and the promise. Morning broke weakly, the sun slipping only halfway through the gray clouds, spilling pale light over the packed snow. Rowan carried a hammer across his shoulder as he walked to the sagging horse shed. The planks had split, groaning in the wind like an old sick horse. Inside, Dusty snorted uneasily, his dark eyes restless. From a distance, Lorian stood wrapped in her coat, watching. Doubt still lingered in her eyes. Was this man here to patch what he could and leave? Or was he truly here to stay through the winter? Rowan said little. He planted the hammer in the snow, studied the shed a moment, and muttered to himself, low and steady, "This needs building back from the ground." The words were simple, yet in the biting wind, they sounded like a vow. He set to work, swinging the axe, splitting fresh timbers. His calloused hands drove the hammer down with firm, rhythmic blows. Each strike echoed across the ridge like the heartbeat of a home learning how to breathe again. Clara and Vera scampered out into the yard, bundled in coats, cheeks flushed bright. They perched on a log, watching him, with every nail driven deep. Clara called out, "It's stronger now. Mama!" Vera clutched yesterday's bread, nibbling between giggles. Lorian moved beside them, watching. Once, the sound of hammering had meant only broken promises, reminders of a man who swore to build a life and left her in the wreckage. But today, every strike of Rowan's hammer felt different, no longer empty words. This was the sound of something real being made. Rowan looked up, caught the eyes fixed on him, and allowed himself a rare smile. His voice was low but firm. "It is mine now," not a claim of ownership, but a declaration, staking part of his life into this place. Lorian's eyes blurred, hot tears stinging at their corners. By afternoon, Rowan had added a new wall along the side. Lorian stepped closer, shawl clutched around her shoulders. "What are you doing there?" she asked softly. "Adding a room," Rowan replied, his eyes never leaving the beam. "Big enough for supplies, or for someone to sleep." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken of staying here before. No one but her and the children. Everyone else had only passed through like desert wind. But Rowan, board by board, was carving permanence into the silence. Vera bounded over, handing him a water flask. His rough hand brushed hers as he took it. "Thanks, little one," he murmured, smiling, before drinking deep. And in that moment, Lorian saw it, the shift in his gaze. No longer just a wanderer, a man who had found the place he belonged. When Rowan bent again to lift the timber, his sleeve slid back, revealing a scar running down his forearm. Lorian froze. "That scar, Abilene," he said simply, "a brawl. Years back." His tone was calm, but his eyes shadowed with memory. Without thinking, Lorien stepped closer, her fingers brushing the rough mark. "You've walked through storms." She paused, her throat tightening. "And now you're here, building shelter for us." Rowan held her gaze. "Steady, not for you, for all of us." In that moment, the storm outside seemed to quiet, and in Lorien's chest, a fragile faith began to take root. This man had not just brought bread, but the weight of his life, planting it into their home. By sunset, the shed stood solid, the last nail-driven home. The sound rang sharp and final, like a pledge struck against stone. Rowan straightened, wiped his brow, and turned to see the structure, firm and whole, for the first time in years. Lorien stepped forward, the girls beside her. Vera squealed, "It looks brand new." Clara slipped her hand into Rowan's, eyes shining. Rowan set down the hammer, exhaled, then repeated slow and certain, his voice deep as the mountain wind. "It is mine now." No one answered, yet Lorien's eyes spoke clear. The fear of abandonment faded, replaced by light. A house, secured not only by wood and nails, but by the presence of the man who had chosen to stay as the ridge burned red with dusk. Their shadows stretched long across the fresh boards, and in the silence, an unspoken promise etched itself into all their hearts. This home no longer belonged to one woman and 2 children alone. It belonged to them. Part 8. The wild rose fence. The long winter had finally withdrawn, leaving behind a tender carpet of green across the ridge. Snowmelt spilled into the creek, tumbling over smooth stones, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and sweet resin. On the porch, Lorien let her hair fall loose for the first time in months. The spring wind threading through soft strands. Her dress was no longer the heavy fabric of survival, but plain homespun, glowing in the new sun. From the barn, Rowan emerged with a bundle in his arms. Thin saplings, their roots wrapped in burlap and damp soil. He spoke quietly. "Wild roses, they take root in dry earth. They stand against wind and sun, and when their time comes, they bloom stronger than anything else." Lorien's gaze fell to the old fence, once only rusted wire and rotting posts. Something stirred inside her. He hadn't said for me or for you. He simply laid the bundle down, as if planting faith itself into the ground. Clara and Vera burst from the porch, eyes bright. "What are they, Uncle Rowan?" Vera asked, her small hands already reaching for the leaves. "They'll grow tall," Rowan told them, handing each girl a small spade. "Come summer, this fence will be heavy with blossoms, shade, fragrance, something to belong to." The girls squealed, laughing as they dug. their little palms smeared with soil. Lorien knelt beside them, guiding their clumsy hands. Mud spattered her dress, but she didn't notice. She hadn't smiled like this in years. Rowan watched quietly, his eyes softening with each root pressed into earth. With every handful of dirt, something more than roses was being planted, a home, rooted by all four of them. By noon, they rested in the sun. Rowan poured water into a wooden cup, passing it to Lorien. Their fingers brushed this time. Neither of them pulled away. She looked out at the line of saplings now marking the fence. Her voice was hushed, as if afraid the wind might overhear. You make everything different. This house, this land, even us. Rowan did not answer right away. He drove his knife into the soil, leaning on the hilt, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where roses grow. There's a home. I'm not planting for myself. I'm planting so you and the girls know there'll be another season waiting. Lorien's throat tightened. The roses had not yet bloomed, and yet her heart had. By evening, the air was thick with sap and bird song. Rowan knelt with the girls, packing soil around the last of the roots. Lorien leaned against the porch post, watching the scene. 3 figures, bent low over the same ground, binding themselves together with more than blood. They were binding themselves with choice. Suddenly, Clara threw her arms around Rowan's waist. He's ours now, Mama, she cried. Lorien flushed, ready to hush her, but Rowan only chuckled, ruffling the child's hair. A rare smile, plain and unguarded, lit his face brighter than any winter fire. Lorien turned away, eyes burning. Children often spoke the truth. Adults were too afraid to. That night, beneath a crescent moon, the old fence shimmered faintly with the promise of new life. Rowan braced fresh posts, tying the young stems carefully so the wind wouldn't break them. Lorien approached with a lantern, the warm light spilling over their worn faces. He glanced at her, voice low as the night itself. Next season, this fence will be heavy with wild roses. It won't just be wood and wire anymore. It'll be alive. Lorien said nothing. She only nodded, holding the lantern closer. Her hand trembled as she passed it, and Rowan covered it with his own. Calloused, warm, steady, a touch that spoke more than vows. Love didn't need fanfare. It was roots holding fast in rocky soil. Along the fence, the young plants breathed quietly, their unseen hearts beginning to beat. And for Lorien, for the first time in years, tomorrow no longer felt like fear. Tomorrow felt like bloom. Part 9. A wedding that spoke of no past. Summer came. The wild roses Rowan and the girls had planted now burst into bloom. White mingled with pink, their fragrance drifting across the hill. What once had been a lonely homestead now breathed with new life. Neighbors who had seldom climbed Widow's Ridge brought gifts in hand: cornbread, salted meat, jugs of apple cider. They had seen him, the cowboy who stayed, the man who hammered posts, rebuilt stalls, raised fences, planted flowers. He was no longer a stranger, no longer a guest. Rowan had claimed this place not with words, but with sweat and timber, and in doing so, he gave the house back, not only to Lorien and her children, but to a community starved for hope. The children darted between the roses, weaving blossoms into their hair. "Mama, our house smells like a garden," Vera cried, her small voice brighter than the morning sun. Lorien bent to kiss her forehead, her eyes brimming. Somehow, their simple joy had become a festival for them all. That day, Lorien wore a white dress, worn thin at the hem, a relic passed down from her mother. No crown, no jewels, no procession, only trembling steps and the smallest of smiles. She stepped from the little room, sunlight cutting through the thin curtain, so her dress seemed spun from light itself. Rowan waited on the porch. Dust still clung to his boots, his shirt rough spun, his hat old and weathered. But when his eyes lifted to her, they lit as if he'd found the world he'd been searching for all his life. For the first time, the quiet cowboy allowed himself a smile of pride, like a man who had finally found the place his soul could rest. Lorien faltered, unsteady beneath that gaze. She had never thought herself worthy of such a look, but Rowan's eyes told her what words never could. No past, no proof, no reckoning, only today and tomorrow. Together, the wedding was held beneath the porch, under the arch of blooming roses. There was no preacher, no hymn, only an old neighbor speaking a few words, laughter ringing out, and nods of quiet agreement. Vera, solemn beyond her years, carried a clutch of wildflowers and placed it in her mother's hands. Clara shrieked with joy, tossing dried petals into the air. Rowan took Lorien's hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. He spoke only one sentence low, steady, certain enough to still the crowd. "It's all behind us now. From here on, we ride together." No one mentioned the man who had left her. No one spoke of the years of hunger, the cold nights of abandonment. The past lay buried like ashes cooling on the wind. What remained was the brightness of roses, the music of laughter, and the quiet vow of two people choosing each other. Here, in a land where law was often written by gun and gallows, this wedding stood for a different kind of justice, the justice of love. A woman once cast aside now stood whole again, not through pity, but through the respect of a man who stayed. The cowboy's pledge was not forged in gold, but in nails, in beams of wood, in the hand that never let go. When neighbors lifted their cups of cider, they knew justice on the frontier was not always courtrooms or bullets. Sometimes it was a single look that said, "I see you, I am here." By evening, the children lay asleep on the porch steps, their hair still tangled with roses. Lorian sat beside Rowan, hands still clasped in his, gazing out at the fence draped in blooms. The air was thick with fragrance, like a blessing spoken without words. Rowan removed his hat, setting it on his knee, then turned to her. Lorian met his gaze at last, no longer flinching away. Their eyes held not burning, not hurried, but calm, like a lake that mirrored the whole sky. This wedding needed no music, no papers, no witness, but the roses. The fence in bloom was proof enough that love had rooted, branched, and blossomed into new life. And for Lorian, it was the fairest gift the world had ever given. Part 10. I stayed. Years had slipped by since the blizzard swallowed the mountainside. Now, summer had laid its golden hand across the wide grasslands. The cicadas hummed. The smell of dry hay drifted in the wind. The old house, once leaning and frail, now stood with a broad porch. Wild roses bloomed along the fence, and children ran laughing across the yard like a flock of sparrows in flight. Vera had grown into a young lady, her laughter clear and ringing like a mountain stream. Clara was still mischievous, climbing onto the back of Dusty the old horse who, even now, bore her weight with patient grace. Beneath the porch roof, Rowan sat in his wooden chair, still whittling small figures from scraps of wood. Time had stiffened his back, and silver now threaded his dark hair. Yet his frame remained steady, strong as the mountains rising behind the homestead. Lorian stepped out, her thin shawl stirring in the warm breeze. Her eyes lingered on the children, on the porch, and finally on the man who had walked into her life that stormy night so many years ago. In her heart rose an old question. If he had ridden on that night, what would have become of me? The afternoon sun stretched long and golden across the shingles, scattering glimmers onto the porch floor. Lorian stood beside Rowan, her voice a soft breath. Do you remember the first day? Rowan paused, lifted his gaze. His eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, the snowstorm of long ago flickered between them. Children's laughter, the rush of the breeze, the gentle rattle of rose petals, all of it faded away until there was only the two of them and the memory that had begun it all. Rowan set down his knife. His rough hand covered hers. He didn't tell the whole story, didn't reach for flowery words. Just 3 plain syllables, steady as carved wood. I stayed. Those words, simple as they were, felt carved into the beams of the porch, into the very soil, into the endless western sky. Rowan was no man for oaths or pretty speeches, but when he said, "I stayed," he meant his life was bound to this land, this home, this woman, and these children. Lorian's throat tightened. Her eyes filled not with the lonely tears of long ago, but with the peace of a woman who had finally found her rest. Her voice trembled as she answered, "And I always will. With you." Out in the yard, the children shouted with joy at some game of their own. The dog barked. Dusty tossed his head, and a cloud of dust lifted into the warm air. The world spun on as always, but in their joined hands, time stood still in a land once ruled only by the gun, where women were too often abandoned and children left behind. Rowan and Lorian's story became another kind of justice, not justice from a court, nor from the barrel of a rifle, but from a man who chose to stay, and from a woman brave enough to open her heart again. The neighbors would whisper, "That cowboy could have gone far, lived the drifting life of the wild trail, but he stayed and built a home instead, and in the dust and blood of the West, such a choice became a legend gentler and more lasting than any gunfight." Rowan didn't need to prove it. The porch itself, the roses blooming on the fence, and the sound of children's laughter were proof enough. Night settled in, carrying the scents of wood and summer flowers. The children slept. The house grew quiet. Rowan and Lorian sat side by side in silence. Stars came out one by one, witnesses to a love that no longer looked back to the storm, but only tended the present and the tomorrow waiting to be born. Lorian rested her head against his shoulder. Rowan squeezed her hand, his eyes fixed on the roses along the fence. His words still lingered in the night. "I stayed, and I always will." It was not only an answer for his wife, but a message to the wide, listening world that sometimes loyalty, kindness, and the choice to remain are the truest ballads of the Old West. Summer's twilight poured gold across the far ridges, spilling light over every wild rose blooming along the fence. Children's laughter rang out like tiny bells, pure and untroubled. On the wooden porch, Rowan sat beside Lorian, his calloused hand firmly clasping hers. Not the hesitant grip of years gone by, but the promise of forever. Her hair brushed his shoulder, carrying the scent of wood and roses in the drifting wind. They spoke no words, for the silence itself was the answer. Once, this place had known only the howl of wind and the ache of loneliness. Now, the scars of the past lay quiet in the dust. The woman who once trembled in a storm had found her haven. The cowboy who once drifted had built his home, and the children once threatened by loss, now thrived in laughter and love. A moment that seemed so ordinary, two hands clasped beneath the summer sun, was in truth the high point of a lifetime, proof that no soul is ever too late to be loved, and that true love is simply the courage to stay. Have you ever known someone patient enough to stay through all your storms? And let me leave you with one more question. If you were in the cowboy's boots, would you stay to protect the town or ride off into the wild? Let me know in the comments.